The question for today is, why are we studying politics? What have you gotten yourself into? What the heck is an anthropology class doing talking about politics?
Inner politics?
That is actually true because politics is very basic to the organization of society. But I also would say that this is one of the longest running debates within, I don't know, maybe anthropology and other social sciences and even just people out there is, what are people naturally like? Why do we need politics? What do some people believe about violence and war?
That's like a natural human instinct.
Yeah, it's that violence and war are inbuilt into human beings. That's why we're always fighting each other. And this comes to us actually from a long time ago, from someone who wrote in Latin sometimes. The Bellum omnium contra omnes in very old English. The war of everyone against everyone, or the war of all against all. So Thomas Hobbes is associated with this. For him, it wasn't an observation that he was making. It was a thought experiment of what he thought people were like in their natural state. And he claimed that it would be everybody, every person for himself. The war of everyone against everyone, the war of all against all. Now, what is somewhat interesting about this is that in our society, we eventually decided that that's okay if people are in a market competition. So for our economics, we have the idea that if we all just follow our self-interest and compete with each other, that everything's going to be fine, and that is the basis for our market economy. Now, that's a little bit of a simplification of Adam Smith's idea that the invisible hand would regulate things in terms of if everyone just did what was best for them personally and traded it, that would work out all right. And so you have this idea that the market should regulate our society in that way because that's what people are like anyway. But when it came to political organization, the idea was from Thomas Hobbes that if people are left to their own devices, we're all just going to kill each other. We'll all just be all violent, and you can't stop them. And so you need something to stop them. You need a Leviathan. You need a strong state, a state apparatus that is going to come down and it's going to make people do the right thing. It's going to make people not be violent to each other. And so this is a very deep philosophical concern, as well as a deep concern within anthropology, as well as a concern about how we run our own society. Can we be a society that does not kill each other, or do we have to have police around all the time to make sure we're not killing each other? And if we don't have the police, we'll just devolve into anarchy. Not the good anarchy, the bad anarchy. Right? So this is actually a philosophy that people have, is that people are going to be warring against each other because that's just human nature. Now, when anthropology comes along 300 years later or so, anthropologists in some ways were supposed to provide the evidence for one of these positions. That is it true that if you go outside of state societies, that people are always fighting each other and in conflict? And Margaret Mead, in 1940, published an essay called "Warfare is Only an Invention, Not a Biological Necessity." Well, this was daring to do in 1940. What was going on in 1940? Yeah, so there were a lot of people who were fighting each other, and in the middle of World War II,
Wasn't involved yet, so we
not yet. Well, yeah, but we were starting to care. It looked like we might have to care. Things were starting to heat up a little bit. And what Mead was saying is, if you look around the world, if you actually go out there and look at other societies, that actually they don't necessarily all fight each other. and that warfare wasn't invented. It is not a biological necessity. So she gave examples of societies that you would go to and you'd tell them about war, and they just get this incomprehensive look on their face, like they couldn't, why would anybody do that? In the same way that the people in Bohannon's story couldn't understand what a ghost was. They just didn't even have a concept of going to war. And we have anthropologists would study societies that were organized and did things without necessarily having a state, a Leviathan, to tell them what to do. So in this chapter, Guest tells us about bands, which are usually associated with hunter-gatherers. What do you get about bands? So here's societies that don't necessarily have a state government, or don't have a state government, and yet they are generally egalitarian, relatively equal. They're usually associated with hunter-gatherers, and that the leaders are in a somewhat fluid state. They might have temporary leaders or chosen somewhat democratically or by consensus, you might say, and they do fine. And then we have tribes, which are larger organizations, but again are mostly associated with herding societies, again, not state societies, and have different forms of leadership, or chiefdoms, in which then in this case you would have a more permanent leader. Again, in this case, mostly associated with larger and more agricultural societies. But in all of these cases, we see people organizing themselves outside of state or government control. And sure, there are conflicts and violence and perhaps even wars, but they're not a big deal. They're not completely dominated by violence and warfare, even outside of the state. Now, before we get too into the bands, tribes, and chiefdoms idea, I do want to emphasize that these are descriptive terms that have been used mostly by archaeologists, actually. They're the people who are looking for bands, tribes, and chiefdoms and states all the time. But there is a little bit of a problem with these typologies, as Guest puts it. One of the reasons I don't like these terms is because tribes and chiefdoms, or tribes and chiefs, have connotations outside of anthropology. For example, what do we assume about who leads a tribe? Yeah. Out there in the world, most of us just assume that tribes are the same as chiefdoms because tribes have chiefs. And so it's strange to have this idea that there are tribes which are not chiefdoms and they're separate. And also the word, it just brings up all these weird connotations in our heads about people with feathers in their hair and all kinds of odd ideas about them. So one of the reasons I don't like this term is that it just brings up some strange ideas about people. The other thing is that all of these societies were in interaction with each other. And so let us say the Inca polity in South America, or the Aztecs, they also dealt with different political organizations. But certainly in colonialism, you had this a reorganization of society. And oftentimes the first question that the Europeans had when they showed up, besides, "Where's your gold?" is, "Take me to your chief," or "Take me to your leader." Right? And so there's an assumption that if you are a society, that you would be governed by something like a king or a chief. And they would often then, if you didn't have one, they would make whoever was perhaps temporarily in charge, they would ascribe permanency to that person. So all of these bands, tribes, and chiefdoms have been influenced by colonialism. Yes, I think that these are best seen as not necessarily a fixed form of social organization, but as a continuum. And you can see how groups and individuals might be in a band or a tribe, but move back and forth between them. And as I said, all of these societies are interacting and trading with each other. Now, there's a recent book that came out 2 years ago. I made the history of anthropological thought. In this book, though, Graeber and Wengrow say that actually it's even more drastic than that, that these groups sometimes change seasonally. That is to say that in the summertime, they might look more like a band, and then in the wintertime, when they go into a different place, they'd be more like a tribe or a chiefdom. And so the idea that societies are fixed in this way is incorrect. However, they think that it is still valuable to think about these different kinds of social organizations as possibilities or experiments in how people organize themselves. So, for the most part, I would say that up until 20, 30 years ago, in some ways, the anthropological perspective on conflict, violence, and war was winning, in the sense that people were like, oh yeah, we don't necessarily need to be fighting each other. That's something that we do culturally. In the last years, the idea of Thomas Hobbes has come back into fashion, in part because we always seem to be fighting each other. So in this edition, the fourth edition, guest introduces us to the invasion of Ukraine from Russia. What's he going to have to put into the fifth edition? Yeah, he missed that by a year. It's out. He isn't able to put that in. It seems like every time we turn around, there's more and more stuff going on, to the extent that what's happening out there. What does it look like in the world when you look out there?
There's always someone hating someone.
It seems like there's always hating someone. War seems normalized and permanent. And so, yeah, we have a number of issues here. And so it's very hard to hold on to the anthropological perspective. Well, what is supposed to be the anthropological perspective here, that third variety? Yeah, I think that it would say that we are neither naturally violent or not violent, but we are extremely shaped by our cultural environment. It's hard to keep insisting on that when you look out at the world. It is hard to insist upon it. So how do we keep doing it? One thing is we have to remember the bonobos. So chimpanzees and bonobos are two separate species. We didn't know about the bonobos for a long time because there are fewer of them, and they look like they might be a chimpanzee, but they're not. And it turns out that humans are equidistantly, evolutionarily speaking, from both. We shared a common ancestor, but then the chimps and bonobos branched off later. Anyway, especially when you put them in controlled environments, when chimpanzees encounter something like food that they might be tense over, they do tend to be rather aggressive. But yes, bonobos, if you give them a bunch of food, they all of a sudden go into like sex with each other to diffuse tension. So it depends which side of humanity you think you're on, if we're more chimp-like or bonobo-like. But the truth is there's nothing evolutionarily speaking that would make us more like one or the other. And so when we look also archaeologically for evidence of warfare, we actually don't see any archaeological evidence for organized warfare, that is to say, one group battling against another group, before 13,000 years ago. We then see an increase around 6,000 years ago, which seems to be associated with agriculture and city-states. But for much of our evolutionary history, we don't see any evidence that there was warfare. We see sporadic interpersonal violence, but not that much. The other thing is, in order to have an army, it requires extensive training for the people that are in that. And if you've been in the army or been through basic training, it's a process by which you are in some ways broken down and then built back up so that you're going to be able to follow orders and be able to kill someone without thinking about it very much. And even a lot of people who have done this and gone to war and then come back, it often causes long-term psychological effects. And so this is not something that people are necessarily naturally doing. They actually do have to be trained into this militarization. The other thing we have to ask as anthropologists is, who sends people to war? It does seem weird. And when you start to think about it, it does seem weird. Yeah, my grandfather said his philosophy was, if they come over here, then you fight them. But you don't go somewhere to fight somebody else, which I thought was good. You don't go somewhere else to fight somebody. You can fight them if they're here. If we all did that, we probably wouldn't have so much war. Who benefits from war? Yeah. So in some ways, there's an impact in different countries. And there's also the fact that the people who are benefiting from this are not just the politicians, but people who are selling arms, right? The weapons manufacturers. When we say, for example, that we are giving aid to Ukraine, that is sometimes true that we're giving stuff like food aid, but oftentimes that's simply aiding our own weapons manufacturers by giving them more business. And that's what we're doing by aiding Ukraine, is just sending business contracts to the people who benefit from making weapons. So what I would say is it's very difficult to try and say, hey, this isn't our natural state. We don't have to have this happen, because it is pretty entrenched. It's been normalized and seems permanent. But I just want to emphasize the seems. It doesn't necessarily have to be this way. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about states and violence, and guest cites Max Weber's definition of a state, which is a very famous in almost any social science book or reference. This has become a touch point for how a state is defined. And we've seen Weber before. Oh yes, we saw him briefly in the chapter on, or the notions of social class, but I told you he was coming back up, so I didn't bother with him then. But Max Weber, this is on page 367 actually, talks about how a state, this was 100 years ago, is the human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force, coercive authority within a given territory. Have we done this before? Have I asked you? Who comes up and starts pummeling me? What am I allowed to do back? Self-defense. Okay, if he's still hitting me, I can hit him back. But what happens if I hit him and now he's just standing there? What should I do? He's come to hit me. I've hit him back, and now he's not hitting me anymore. Am I allowed to knife him?
No.
Why not? He was hitting me first. What should I do? What should I do? What? No. No. What am I supposed to do? Call the police. That's
okay.
right. I'm not supposed to escalate the situation. Once I've defended myself and I'm not under assault, if he pulls out a knife, then I can pull out a knife too. And we can escalate as long as there's no police around. But I'm not allowed to just do it independently. I'm supposed to call in the police and they can shoot us. And that's legitimate. That's how it works.
It is how it works.
It is how it works. If you call the police, you just have to be aware that they're allowed to use legitimate force, and that's whatever they think it is.
They might
Yeah.
get put on desk duty for that. Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, something might
Seems like a
happen.
pretty harsh punishment to me.
They might get yelled at and say, you're a mean.
Right. So the thing is, in most societies that have states, you're not supposed to use physical force, and the state is the one that has legitimate use of physical force or coercive authority. If the police walked in here and put me in handcuffs and walked me out, what would you think?
They read you your rights.
You did something bad?
Yeah, they should read me. They should say I have the right to remain silent. They're supposed to say that before they handcuff me. But yes, you would think, wonder what he did. Shit, must have done something bad, right? So we assume that they have the right, the state has the right to do this. They have legitimate use of physical force. Now, this is an interesting idea. In practice, though, it probably doesn't apply to a lot of the world's states. including our own. Let's say that this works best if you have gun control. If you don't have gun control, then everybody feels like it's their legitimate right to go out and do something with guns, and the police have to show up with guns, and so you have everybody shooting each other. So it works better perhaps in places where they have control over the guns, but it's an interesting idea. Now, the question is, how does a state get a monopoly on physical force? A monopoly, that is to say, they're the only ones that can do it. And why do we consider the state to have legitimate use of physical force if they can do that? How do we do this? What do we have if the state arrests me and you're like, must have been a bad guy? What does that mean? Even though I'm a good guy. The hegemonic aspect of power. That's hegemony, baby. Yeah, so the idea is that we agree that the people that are arrested are bad, and so you just go get them. So as we look at today's world, one of the big questions is, do the nation states still have hegemony, control over their territory? One of the day's issues is that there's a lot of things that are traveling between people. So there's lots of people crossing borders. There's lots of stuff crossing borders. And as we might have realized in the last election, this is a huge issue. How much control should people have over things and people that are crossing borders? And it's not just in our country, this is an issue around the world. Do states still have hegemony over things? And even if we have hegemony, what happens? Yeah. Basically, however bad things get, Gus tells us that humans might not want to do what you're trying to do. And so the dominance is never absolutely complete, which leads us to an interesting idea, which is that, in fact, state dominance may not be quite as dominant as we thought. That in some cases, states are more fluid and fragile. And if people have this agency to resist dominance, well, what should we be doing in this situation? What are anthropologists often studying outside of, say, state control? Yeah, so one of the things that anthropologists have looked at are these movements outside of state control, outside of state hegemony, which are aiming to address some of these issues. And if we look at this again from an anthropological perspective, we might be able to see that the idea of state dominance is not quite as complete as they would like us to believe. I feel like in today's world, we are seriously getting close to a state, our own, that might be more fluid and fragile than we think. I don't know how to think about our current situation